Good evening. It's getting kind of late. It's that hour when the day begins to fade and the shadows start to settle in for the night. Most people seek out a place like this for a bit of warmth, a moment of comfort in a cup. We do serve comfort here, of a sort, but it's a thin veneer, I assure you. This is the Night Cafe, a place where the aroma of coffee mingles with the faint metallic scent of fear, and the hiss of steam often sounds uncannily like a final whispered warning. Here, the menu offers more than just lattes and cappuccinos. It offers lessons. Every painting on these walls is a window, and every story we tell is a special blend, ground from the bitter beans of human folly. We serve our tales dark with no sugar to cut the taste. We have portraits of obsession that cling to the palate, landscapes of sorrow with a chillingly long finish, and still lifes depicting technological marvels that promise convenience while demanding your soul as payment. So, find a table, get comfortable if you can. The brew is fresh, the lighting is low, and the first story is just about to be served. It's a dark roast. We think you'll find it has notes of desperation with just a hint of damnation. Every small town has its secrets, its local delicacies, its reclusive old craftsmen. The secret to Mr. Collins' honey, however, is not in the flower, but in the flock. Submitted for your consideration, this unsettling still life, a perfect golden honeycomb, with one cell containing something far more personal than nectar. We call this one the beekeeper's apprentice. Caleb was running on the fumes of his last bad decision. A mountain of debt and a hastily abandoned life in the city had chased him east, into the sweltering, cicada-screaming heart of a Massachusetts August. The job posting had been a godsend, a life preserver to a drowning man. Apprentice wanted for historic apiary. Room, board, and stipend provided, no experience necessary, must have a quiet disposition. Now, he didn't know anything about keeping bees, but he thought he'd give it a try. The drive from Sturbridge proper devolved into a crawl down a dirt road that seemed determined to shake his rattling sedan to pieces. Collins' Apiaries was less a farm and more a clearing carved out of the deep woods, an island in a sea of oak and pine. Dozens of white-painted beehive boxes stood in neat rows, silent and watchful as a waiting congregation. The air was thick, syrupy with the smell of honey, beeswax, and something else. Something vaguely metallic and sweet, like clover and old blood. Mr. Amos Collins emerged from the small, weathered salt-box house as if summoned by the crunch of Caleb's tires. He was as old and gnarled as the apple trees that dotted his property, his skin tanned to the texture of cracked leather. His eyes, however, were a startlingly pale blue, and they seemed to hum with the same energy as the air around him. "You're Caleb," Amos stated. It wasn't a question. "The bees are agitated by the sound of your engine. They dislike discord." The interview was short and strange. Amos spoke of his bees not as livestock, but as a collective entity, a single intelligence he called the congregation or the chorus. He explained that the famed Collins honey, a delicacy that sold for astronomical prices in Boston and New York, was not a product of simple nectar. "Nectar is crude," Amos rasped, his voice dry as rustling leaves. "Any fool with a flower patch can get nectar. The chorus, they are more discerning. They gather essences, the resonant notes of a well-lived life." Caleb, desperate and sweating in the oppressive heat, nodded along, assuming it was the poetic ramblings of an old eccentric. He just needed the room and the stipend. When Amos led him to the hives, the buzzing rising to a deafening thrum, Caleb felt a strange calm instead of fear. The bees swirled around him, a living vortex of gold and black, but not a single one offered to sting him. Amos gave a rare, craggy smile. "The interview is complete. The congregation accepts you. You may begin tomorrow." The work was hard but rhythmic. Caleb learned to smoke the hives, to check the frames, to harvest the honey. But the oddities continued to mount. The honey itself was always warm to the touch, and when he scraped the wax caps off the honeycomb, the rich amber liquid seemed to pulsate with a faint inner light. The bees moved with an unsettling purpose, their flight patterns less like foraging and more like a coordinated patrol of the property's perimeter. One afternoon, a portly man in a polo shirt and expensive slacks arrived, waving a sheaf of papers. He was a developer named Henderson, and he spoke loudly of zoning violations and eminent domain. Amos stood before him, placid and unmoving. "This land is older than your laws," Amos said, his voice flat, "and the congregation does not appreciate trespassers. Their honey turns bitter when they are disturbed." Henderson laughed, called Amos a crazy old coot, and threatened legal action before storming off. That evening, Amos was contemplative. "A sharp, discordant essence," he murmured to Caleb, looking out towards the woods. "It makes for a poor vintage." A week later, Henderson was on the local news. His car was found abandoned on the side of the road near the entrance to the Collins farm. Of the man himself, there was no trace. The town buzzed with speculation. Caleb's blood ran cold. That night, Amos offered him a spoonful of the newest harvest to celebrate the quiet evening, the old man said. Caleb hesitated, then accepted. The honey exploded on his tongue, a symphony of sweetness, but beneath it were other flavors, other feelings. He felt a flash of indignant rage, the slick satisfaction of a well-played round of golf, the cloying taste of cheap cigars, and a final, overpowering wave of pure, shrieking terror. He pulled back, choking, his mind reeling with the echoes of another man's life, Henderson's life. He finally understood what Amos meant by essences in the honey. The next day, Amos left for his monthly supply run into town. Caleb knew what he had to do. His target was the one place Amos had forbidden him to go near, a single massive hive at the far end of the property, painted not white, but a flat, light-absorbing black. Amos called it the Cathedral. The buzzing around it seemed different somehow, a low, resonant chant that vibrated in Caleb's bones. With trembling hands, he lit the smoker, puffing thick clouds of calming smoke into the entrance. He pried the heavy lid off. The stench that rolled out was overwhelming. Honey and rot, life and decay. He peered inside, and his sanity instantly frayed. It was not a normal hive. The honeycomb was warped into strange organic architecture, and in the center, where the queen should be, was a pulsating, translucent mass of wax, propolis, and something else. Embedded within it, like fossils in ember, were the last vestiges of Amos's victims. He saw the glint of a watch face, the faded floral pattern of a woman's scarf, the plastic frame of a pair of eyeglasses. And there, perfectly preserved and staring up at him, was Henderson's right eye. The bees weren't killers. They were harvesters. They consumed a person, their memories, their fears, their triumphs, their very soul, and distilled it all into their horrifying, transcendent honey. A shadow fell over him. "It is a sacred cycle," Amos's voice rasped from behind him. He hadn't gone to town at all. "We offer them a vessel, a life, and in return, they give us a taste of eternity. He was a bitter vintage, as I predicted, all bluster and fear." Caleb scrambled backwards, falling to the ground, his mind screaming. Amos looked down at him, not with anger, but with the patient expression of a teacher. "I am old, Caleb. My own essence grows thin. The congregation needs a new vicar, a new keeper to guide the harvest." He gestured with a gnarled hand from the grotesque hive to Caleb. "It is a position of great honor." The choice hung in the humming air, thick and heavy as the honey itself. Refuse and become nothing more than raw material for the next batch. Accept and become a monster. "The congregation is always hungry," Amos said softly. "They're patient, but they must be fed." Caleb looked from the old man's pale, knowing eyes to the black hive, where 1,000 bees were now pouring out, their buzzing rising in a chorus of anticipation. One landed on the back of his hand. It didn't sting. It simply waited, its legs tickling his skin, as if waiting for his command. A terrible choice. To be the harvest or the harvester. For our young apprentice, the line between man and monster has become as thin as a bee's wing. It's a chilling reminder that some traditions are best left to die out, lest they require a fresh sacrifice. On display here in the Night Cafe. A contract is a sacred thing, but what of contracts written a century ago, or rights of way that no longer exist? Our next exhibit here in the Night Cafe deals with such a dilemma. A portrait of a lonely railroad crossing sign guarding a track that isn't there, and a warning that a cynical developer chose to ignore. This is called the right of way. Jim Godfrey saw the world as a spreadsheet, and on it, the 150 acres of rolling woodland outside Spencer, Massachusetts, was a screaming bargain. The land was beautiful, untouched, and most importantly, dirt cheap. He finalized the purchase on a Tuesday, his expensive pen scratching a signature that felt like a conquest. The seller, a man whose family had owned the land since before the Civil War, hesitated before passing over the deed. "You read the covenant, Mr. Godfrey. Section 4? Jim gave a dismissive wave. "The spook story clause? My lawyers had a good laugh over that one. Something about a railroad." "It's not a story," the man said quietly. "It's a right of way." Jim glanced at the archaic, florid script in the old deed. The therein described parcel is subject to a perpetual and unbreakable right of way granted to the Boston Albany Rail Company, its successors, or its spectral assignees, to be honored in perpetuity. "Spectral assignees," Jim chuckled. "Charming. I'll be sure to send them a muffin basket." He strode out of the office, the deed in his briefcase, his mind already landscaping, subdividing, and building his new masterpiece, Sylvan Meadows. The warnings continued, quieter but more persistent, as construction began. Evelyn Reed, the town clerk, a woman with eyes that seemed to hold the town's entire history, cornered him by the surveyor's stakes. "That's the old railbed you're marking for the cul-de-sac," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You can still see the indentation if you know where to look." "I see a prime lot with a lovely view, Evelyn," Jim replied, clapping dust from his hands. "Progress." Weeks later, his foreman, a burly man named Mac, approached him, twisting the brim of his hard hat. "Strange things, Mr. Godfrey. The men are spooked. They hear a train whistle at night, but the nearest active line is 10 miles away. Tools rattling on the ground, the smell of coal smoke when the air is still, and that old sign." He pointed toward the edge of the property, where a single rusted railroad crossing sign stood guard over a deserted country crossroads. There were no tracks, just dirt roads meeting in the afternoon sun. "Last night," Max said, his voice low, "its lights were flashing. Both of them. No wires, no power. They just flashed." "Faulty wiring in their heads," Jim snapped. "It's superstition. Get rid of that piece of junk tomorrow." But the next day, the crew assigned to remove the sign refused. They found a freshly laid railroad spike at the base of the sign, cool to the touch, but smelling of the forge. Jim's frustration mounted. He was a man of concrete and steel, of profit margins and deadlines. He would not be delayed by ghost stories. He pushed the crews harder. Sylvan Meadows rose from the earth, a monument to vinyl siding and two-car garages, built directly atop the memory of the old rail line. In late July, with the model home completed and furnished, Evelyn Reed appeared one last time. She carried a brittle, yellowed newspaper clipping. "I felt it was my duty to inform you," she said, offering him the clipping. The headline read, "Tragedy on the Midnight Special. Scores perish in derailment." The date was August 1st, 1892. "A flash flood washed out the bridge over Miller's Creek," Evelyn explained, her gaze fixed on the picture window of his new model home. "The creek used to run right where your foundation is now. They say the train was running late, trying to make up time. It plunged into the ravine at 12:05 a.m. It's been trying to complete its run ever since." She looked at him, her expression one of grim finality. "Tomorrow is August 1st, Mr. Godfrey. The train is late. It has been for 133 years, but it always tries to keep its schedule. That sealed it. Jim decided he would spend the night of August 1st in the model home. He'd throw a small party for the investors, uncork some champagne, and post pictures online. He would mock the ghosts right out of existence and turn the local superstition into a marketing gimmick. By 11:30 p.m. on August 1st, the investors were gone, and Jim sat alone in the pristine living room. He swirled a glass of expensive scotch, feeling smug. The house was perfect. The silence was absolute. He was the king of his new, quiet kingdom. But at 12:01 a.m., he felt it. A low, rhythmic vibration in the floorboards. So faint, he thought it was his imagination. Thump-thump, thump-thump, thump-thump. It grew steadily, a deep, pounding pulse that resonated in his chest. Then came the sound, a mournful, distant whistle that grew rapidly in pitch and volume, slicing through the night. It was joined by a deafening clatter, the sound of immense steel wheels on iron tracks that were not there. The glasses on the granite countertop began to tremble. Jim stumbled to the large picture window, his heart hammering. Cutting through the darkness was a single, brilliant white light, brighter than any modern headlight. It was racing towards him, illuminating his perfectly manicured lawn and newly paved driveway. Behind it, a colossal black locomotive took shape, billowing clouds of thick gray smoke that didn't rise or dissipate, but clung to the ground like a shroud. It was a phantom from another century, immense and unstoppable. He saw the glowing embers in the firebox, the silhouette of the engineer leaning out the window. Behind it, passenger cars trailed, their gaslights casting a pale, flickering glow on the silent, staring faces of the passengers within. Men in bowler hats, women in high-collared dresses, their expressions placid and vacant. Jim screamed, a thin, useless sound swallowed by the roar. He braced for an impact that would obliterate him. But the train did not hit the house. It passed through it. An unearthly, bone-aching cold swept through the room as the spectral engine breached the wall. The roar was all-encompassing. The smell of hot metal, steam, and ozone filled his lungs. For a surreal, horrifying moment, he saw the interior of a 19th century mail car superimposed over his designer kitchen. Spectral mailbags phasing through his stainless steel refrigerator. He was a ghost in its unyielding reality. The train passed, car after spectral car, a procession of the dead on their final endless journey. As the last observation car, its red lantern growing like a baleful eye, faded through the far wall, the silence returned, sharp and sudden. For a heartbeat, the house stood intact. Then, with a groaning shriek of tortured materials, the physics of Jim's world reasserted themselves against the memory of what had just passed. The foundation cracked, the walls buckled inward, the roof began to collapse. The model home began to implode upon itself as if its very existence had been a violation of a law far older and more powerful than any building code. Dawn broke over Spencer, the sky a soft, indifferent pink. Where the flagship home of Sylvan Meadows had stood, there was only a pile of splintered wood and shattered drywall. From it, a perfectly straight line of destruction cut a swath through the entire development, a scar of rubble and ruin tracing the path of the old tracks. At the deserted crossroads, the old railroad crossing sign stood silent. Its lights were dark. Its warning had been delivered. Its perpetual right-of-way had been honored. Mr. Jim Godfrey, a man of concrete and capital, learned a hard lesson in eminent domain. He discovered that some contracts are not written in ink, but in iron and steam, and that the past always tries to keep its schedule. The Midnight Special, you see, is a train with a permanent, unbreakable lease. On display here in the Night Cafe. A library. A place of perfect order where every story has its place. But in the archives of this local library, there is one volume that defies categorization. This painting depicts a simple book cart and its single untitled passenger. A book whose story must never be finished or filed. For your consideration here in the Night Cafe, this one's called Do Not Reshelf. Bob Kelso believed in order. He believed the universe, at its core, was a vast library and that chaos was simply a book shelved in the wrong section. At 28, he was a man made of quiet anxieties and a desperate need for things to be in their proper place. This compulsion had led him, inevitably, to his new post as a night archivist at the public library. The library was his cathedral. He loved the hush that fell after the last patron left, the smell of decaying paper and binding glue, the towering shelves that rose like ancient redwood trees into the gloom. His supervisor, Mr. Porter, a man who seemed to be woven from the same dust and shadows as the archives themselves, gave him the tour on his first night. The rules were simple, the duties clear, until the very end. Porter stopped in aisle 7, a cramped corridor dedicated to antiquarian town history. He pointed a long, bony finger at a rolling metal cart tucked into a nook. On its bottom shelf sat a single, anonymous book. It was bound in plain, dark brown leather, with no title on the spine, no call number, no markings of any kind. "This is the last rule, Bob, and it's the only one that matters," Porter said, his voice a dry whisper. "The book on this cart. You will dust it. You will ensure it is not disturbed. You will treat it with respect, but you will not, under any circumstances, attempt to reshelve it. It stays on the cart. Is that understood?" Bob, a stickler for rules, nodded vigorously. "Of course, Mr. Porter." But the book began to haunt him. In a world of perfect Dewey Decimal classification, it was a glaring anomaly. It was a question mark in a building devoted to answers. Every night, Bob would complete his duties, cataloging new acquisitions, repairing bindings, sweeping the aisles, and he would always end up in aisle 7, staring at the nameless book on its lonely cart. It felt like a challenge, a flaw in the system he was meant to uphold. A clerical error, if you will, left uncorrected for decades. His orderly mind spun with possibilities. It was a donated volume that had lost its paperwork. It was a mislaid piece of a larger collection. Whatever the reason, its homelessness was an offense to the very concept of a library. After 3 weeks of this silent torment, on a sweltering August night where the air outside was thick with the drone of insects, Bob's resolve crumbled. The library was empty and silent, his only companion the rhythmic tick of the grand clock in the main hall. He wheeled the cart out from its nook and, with trembling hands, lifted the book. It was heavy, solid. He broke Porter's one true rule and opened it. It was a ledger. The paper was old and brittle, the handwriting an elegant script. It was a list of names, each followed by 2 dates. He read the first entry on a random page. Jeremiah Poole, May 3, 1881, October 19, 1952. He read another, more recent one near the end. Margaret Bishop, March 12, 1948, July 23, 2025. Bob's breath caught in his throat. He remembered Margaret Bishop's obituary in the Herald just last week. He hurried to the digital archives and cross-referenced a dozen other names. All of them matched the town's birth and death records perfectly. He was holding a catalog of lives, a complete accounting of stories that had begun and, more importantly, had ended. His librarian's mind, trained to see patterns and impose order, arrived at a perfectly logical and perfectly wrong conclusion. This wasn't some cursed object. It was a primary source document, a completed biography of souls. Its lack of a title or a call number was simply a processing error from a bygone era. The cart was not its home. It was a temporary holding pen for a story that needed to be filed away. His duty was clear. He had to fix the error. He had to give the book its proper place in the hallowed halls of the library. The quest consumed him. He spent hours poring over the library's own arcane catalogs, cross-referencing binding systems and paper acidity. The book's physical makeup suggested it belonged with other town histories from the late 1700s. He began to search the shelves in the deep archives, running his fingers along the spines, his heart thrumming with a sense of purpose. He found it just after 3 a.m. On a high shelf in a section dedicated to local family genealogies, there was a single book-sized gap. The space was coated in a thin layer of dust, but it was an interruption in an otherwise unbroken line of leather-bound volumes. It felt like a socket waiting for an eye. It was literally humming with emptiness. With a sense of profound solemnness, he retrieved the rolling ladder. He climbed, the book held reverently in both hands. He paused at the top, Porter's grave warning echoing in his mind. But then he looked at the empty space, at the chaotic anomaly of the book in his hands, and his purpose hardened. He was bringing order. He was closing a chapter. He slid the book into the empty space. The sound of the smooth leather spine scraping against the shelf was shockingly loud in the silence. It fit perfectly. For a moment, he felt a wave of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. The error had been corrected. The system was whole again. At the exact moment the book settled into place, a deep, resonant thrum passed through the library, as if a vast, unseen machine had just engaged a new gear. A cold draft, smelling of blank paper and ozone, whipped through the aisle, extinguishing the warmth of the August night. Bob felt a sudden, dizzying sense of hollowness, a feeling of being untethered. Shaken, he climbed down the ladder. The feeling of triumph had already evaporated, replaced by a creeping dread. He packed up his things, eager for the morning, for the sun. As he walked towards the exit, an inexplicable compulsion made him glance back down aisle 7. His heart stopped. The cart was no longer empty. He walked back, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. It was impossible. He knew he had shelved the book, yet there it was, sitting on the bottom shelf of the cart, a dark, silent accusation. He must have imagined it. He must be overtired. He reached the cart, his breath held tight in his throat. It was the same plain, leather-bound volume, but something was different. The spine was no longer blank. Embossed in faint, freshly minted gold leaf were 2 words: Bob Kelso. The truth, in all its cosmic, bureaucratic horror, crashed down upon him. The book on the cart was never a completed story. It was a placeholder, a blank entry, a life unassigned, held in a terrible, orderly limbo. By closing the file on Margaret Bishop and all the others, by declaring their stories finished and showing them, he had created a vacancy, and the library, an ancient entity that abhorred a vacuum, had simply filled the opening. He reached out a trembling hand, but couldn't bring himself to touch it. He was no longer the archivist. He had become an acquisition, a story waiting to be written, a nameless thing waiting for its end, so that he too could be properly, finally, reshelved. The library was silent once more, its terrible, imperfect order restored. Our librarian, a man who loved order above all else, simply couldn't abide a book without a home. In fixing what he thought was a clerical error, he created a vacancy. The library, which we said abhors a vacuum, was only too happy to fill it with him. On display now in the night cafe. The pursuit of the perfect flavor, the ultimate taste. For the connoisseur, it's a lifelong quest. Our story deals with a winemaker who claims to have perfected his craft, and a critic invited for a private tasting. For your consideration, this painting, a single glass of deep red wine, containing something far more complex than grapes. A vintage of vanity here in the night cafe, we call the venophile. Jonah Fox's palate was a weapon. As the chief food and wine critic for the Boston Quarterly, he wielded it with the precision of a master duelist, eviscerating reputations with a well-aimed adjective and building empires with a single superlative paragraph. He was a man who had tasted everything and been impressed by almost nothing. His cruelty was as legendary as his taste, for he believed that a discerning palate gave him the right to not merely review, but to judge. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. The cardstock was as thick as a credit card, smelling faintly of cedar and old money. The script was elegant, embossed. It was from a Mr. Alex Denton of Veritas Vineyard, a name spoken only in the most exclusive circles. Denton's wines were the stuff of myth, impossibly rare, obscenely expensive, and said to provide an experience that transcended mere taste. For Jonah, a man who had conquered every other culinary peak, Veritas Vineyard was his Everest. The invitation was not a request, it was a summons. The journey from Boston into the deep Berkshires was a gradual shedding of the modern world. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to a narrow, winding dirt lane, flanked by ancient, grasping trees. The estate, when he finally reached it, was a Gothic masterpiece of dark stone and ivy, overlooking a valley of meticulously cultivated grapevines. The vines themselves were old, gnarled, their woody trunks reaching from the soil like arthritic fingers. The earth between them was an unnaturally deep, rich black. Alex Denton met him at the door. He was a slight man, impeccably dressed in a tweed jacket, with a gentle, almost serene smile. He was disarmingly charming, treating Jonah not as a critic to be feared, but as a fellow artist to be admired. "Mr. Fox," Denton said, his voice smooth as aged port, "an honor. Your palate is, of course, legendary. I've long dreamed of subjecting my humble efforts to such a formidable instrument." He led Jonah to a tasting room paneled in dark mahogany. A fire crackled in the hearth. On a polished table sat a decanter of water, a basket of plain crackers, and 3 exquisite crystal glasses, waiting. "I am a student of terroir, Mr. Fox," Denton explained as he uncorked the first bottle. "The French concept that the land, the soil, the climate, the very spirit of a place, imparts a unique character to the wine. I believe the soil is a library, holding the memory of all that has lived and died within it. My work is simply to translate those memories into a language we can taste." Jonah nodded, intrigued. It was sophisticated marketing, to be sure, but delivered with the conviction of a true believer. Denton poured the first glass, a wine with surprisingly vibrant, youthful color. A 1985. I call this one the Optimist. Jonah swirled the glass, inhaled deeply, and then took a sip. His critic's mind immediately began composing the prose, an emulent, almost naive nose of summer strawberries and bright ambition. The palate is bold, full of unexplored potential, but it falls away into a surprisingly quick, almost tragically short finish. "Remarkable," he said aloud. Denton smiled. "Let us try something more mature." He opened a second bottle, the wine a deeper, more contemplative garnet. A 1996, called The Scholar. This glass stopped Jonah cold. The experience was profound. In his mind, he wrote, brooding, complex, with austere notes of old paper, leather, and bitter chocolate. There's a deep, melancholic acidity that lingers, hinting at long nights and profound unanswered questions. It was like tasting a feeling, an entire life of quiet study and sorrow. A sliver of unease, cold and sharp, pierced Jonah's professional admiration. How was this even possible? "And for the third," Denton continued, his eyes gleaming in the firelight, "something with more passion. A 2004 vintage, The Lover. The aroma alone was intoxicating. The taste was a tempest, an explosive rush of wild raspberry and crushed rose petal, underpinned by distinct saline minerality, like tears. The finish is long, clinging, almost possessive." Jonah felt flushed, his analytical detachment dissolving in the wine's emotional onslaught. He had never tasted anything like it. "Your secret, Mr. Denton?" Jonah said, his voice a little thick. "This is beyond terroir. What is your secret?" Alex Denton leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You're right, of course. A palate like yours cannot be so easily fooled. You tasted the ambition in the first glass, the melancholy in the second, the passion in the third. You tasted them because they are there. My terroir is enhanced." He paused, letting the sentence hang in the air. "The young stockbroker I buried near the east slope after the crash of '87. His ambition was boundless. He fertilizes the optimist." The reclusive poet who lived down the road with his library of tragic verse. He nourishes the scholar. The tempestuous couple from New York who had their final fatal argument on my property. Their passion was so potent, it sustains the lover to this day. The blood drained from Jonah's face. The rich taste in his mouth turned to ash. He was not drinking wine. He was drinking people. You see, Denton continued, his voice dreamily calm, the vines are not fussy eaters. They are patient. They drink everything, joy, sorrow, genius, despair. I'm merely the humble vintner who finds the proper vessel for the vintage. I am a curator of souls. Jonah shot to his feet, his chair clattering backwards. You, sir, are a monster. I am an artist, Denton corrected gently, and an artist must have his critics. Which brings me to the final tasting. He produced a single, unlabeled bottle from the shadows, its contents a deep, swirling crimson, darker than the others. I've been cultivating this one for some time, waiting for the perfect guest to share it with. A new release. I call this one The Critic. He poured a single glass and slid it across the table. It stopped directly in front of Jonah. The critic was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a terror so profound it felt like a physical weight. He stared into the glass. It was not his reflection he saw on its polished surface. From the dark, viscous heart of the wine, a face began to resolve. It swirled into focus, tiny, perfect, and contorted in a silent, final judgment. Its mouth was open in a scream of exquisite agony. It was his own face. It has notes of arrogance, I think, Alex Denton said softly, leaning forward. A complex bouquet of intellectual vanity, with a sharp, acidic finish of profound and utter terror. Don't you agree, Mr. Fox? I do so value your opinion. So, the critic, a man whose palate was his weapon, finally met an artist whose medium was mortality. He learned the terrible truth of the vintage, that the secret ingredients was life itself, just before being offered the final tasting. A vintage named for him. A full-bodied terror, with a finish of absolute finality. On display here in the Night Cafe. Now, grief is a garden in which little else can grow. But what if a seed existed that could not only grow in such barren soil, but flourish, turning sorrow into breathtaking beauty? We offer this painting, a botanical study in macabre symbiosis, a flower of impossible color, with roots that suggest a terrible intimate price for its bloom. This one's called The Gardener's Gift. The silence in the house was the loudest thing Amelia had ever heard. It was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that had smothered all the joy since her husband Mark had passed. He had been the life of the house, the life of the garden. Now looking out the kitchen window at the tangle of weeds and withered rose bushes, Amelia saw only a reflection of the desolation in her own heart. It was August 1st, their anniversary, and the silence was screaming. Driven by a sudden, desperate need to do something other than drown in the silence, she decided to reclaim the garden. It was Mark's sanctuary. Maybe she could find a ghost of him there. She drove to a nursery she had never noticed before, tucked away on a back road outside town. It was called Verdant's Oddities and Organics, and it looked less like a garden center and more like a place that had sprouted from the earth itself. The proprietor, a man who introduced himself as Mr. Verdant, was as ancient as the gnarled oak tree that shaded his shop. He had soil under his fingernails that looked centuries old, and his eyes were the color of new spring leaves. He listened patiently as Amelia described her wilted garden and her wilted spirit. He didn't lead her to the cheerful marigolds or the sturdy petunias. Instead, he reached under the counter and produced a small velvet pouch. From it, he tipped a single seed into his palm. It was the size of a robin's egg, smooth, jet black, and seemed to absorb the light around it, leaving a tiny void in the center of his hand. "This is not for sale," Mr. Verdant said, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "It is a gift, a balm for a sorrow as deep as yours." He closed his hand over hers, pressing the seed into her palm. It was unnervingly warm. Plant it in a place that holds a strong memory. Water it only with water that has passed through your own hands, and tend to it. It will give back what you put into it. That evening, Amelia planted the seed in the center of the garden, in the exact spot where she and Mark had shared their first picnic years ago. Following the strange instructions, she cupped water from the spigot in her hands and let it trickle into the dark, rich soil. The plant sprouted overnight. Its stem was a deep royal purple, and the leaves that unfurled were like soft black velvet. Amelia, who had felt nothing but a dull ache for months, felt a flicker of wonder. She began to spend her days in the garden, weeding and cultivating the soil around the strange new life. She talked to it, telling it stories about Mark, about their life together, watering it faithfully with her own hands. The plant, which she began to call Mark's Requiem, grew with an unnatural speed. Within a week, it produced a bud. When it opened, Amelia gasped. The flower was breathtaking, a thing of impossible beauty. Its petals were like spun silk, shimmering with an otherworldly iridescence that shifted from deep violet to silver to the exact blue of Mark's eyes. And its fragrance, it was the scent of peace. When she was near it, the heavy blanket of her grief lifted, replaced by a warm, euphoric calm. For the first time since the funeral, she felt a semblance of happiness. The plant became her world. As it flourished, producing more and more spectacular blooms, Amelia's devotion grew into obsession. The garden around it revived with an impossible vitality, while the rest of the lawn yellowed and withered. Her life shrank to the size of her backyard. Her friend, Clara, was the first to notice the change in Amelia. "You look tired, Ames," she said over the phone. "Are you eating?" "I'm fine," Amelia insisted, her voice distant. "The fragrance from the garden. It's all the nourishment I need." When Clara finally visited a month later, she was horrified. Amelia was a wraith. Her skin was pale and translucent, her clothes hung on her gaunt frame, and there were dark, bruised-looking circles under her eyes. But her expression was one of serene, untroubled bliss. "My God, Amelia, what's happening to you?" Clara cried. "I'm happy, Clara," Amelia said softly, leading her into the backyard. "Look." The plant was now a beautiful shrub, a riot of impossible color and light dominating the garden. It was beautiful, but it was a predatory, cancerous kind of beauty. "This thing is killing you," Clara said, her voice trembling. "We need to call a doctor. We need to get you out of here." "No," Amelia's calm shattered. "You don't understand. It's all I have left of him. It takes away the pain. It's taking away you." Clara grabbed Amelia's frail arm. "I'm not going to let you wither away for a damn flower." She tried to pull Amelia toward the house, but Amelia dug in her heels, her surprising strength born of desperation. In the struggle, Clara stumbled backward, her hand brushing against one of the plant's large, velvety leaves. A shock, cold and electric, jolted up her arm. She felt a sudden, dizzying wave of exhaustion, a phantom memory of a grief that was not her own. She saw a flash of a hospital room, heard the beep of a failing monitor. The plant had touched her, and for a second, it had tasted her vitality. Amelia saw the look of horror on Clara's face, and she finally understood. Her blood ran cold. Mr. Verdant's words echoed in her mind. "It will give back what you put into it." She had poured in her love, her memories, her bottomless grief. The plant had taken it, all of it. The euphoric peace she felt wasn't happiness. It was the sensation of being emptied. The plant wasn't a monument to her love. It was a parasite, feeding on it. Her horrified gaze fell to the base of the plant. The rich black soil seemed to shift, and for a terrifying instant, she saw the root system beneath the surface. It was not a tangle of woody fibers. It was a writhing, knotted mass of pale white forms that looked horrifyingly, unmistakably, like grasping human hands. "Amelia, please," Clara sobbed, scrambling away from the plant. "Let's go. Now." But Amelia didn't move. She looked at her own translucent hands, then at the magnificent blooming plant. To destroy it, to leave, would mean inviting the crushing, screaming silence back into her life. the agony of her loss would return in full force. This beautiful, terrible thing was all she had. In its monstrous, symbiotic way, it truly was Mark's requiem, a living headstone built from the very essence of her love. She made a choice. With a soft, sad smile, she gently pushed Claire away. "It's all right," she whispered. She sank to her knees before the plant, not in terror, but in final, loving surrender. She reached out and laid her hands on its central stem. From the edge of the garden, Claire watched in horror. As Amelia made contact, the entire plant pulsed with light. It erupted in a final, impossibly brilliant bloom, its colors searing the very air. Amelia's body went limp, a peaceful, empty smile on her lips as the last of her life force flowed into her creation. The gardener's gift had been given, and had been paid for in full. She only sought to ease her sorrow, and so she did. She nurtured her love into a beautiful living monument, and in turn, it consumed her. A chilling reminder that the deepest loves and the deepest griefs can sometimes demand everything we have left to give. On display here in the Night Cafe. Hollywood is a town that worships youth and discards age like yesterday's newspaper. For one washed-up actor, the fear of fading away was so great, he made a deal with a very unusual portrait of himself in his prime, a painting, seen here, that agreed to do his aging for him, for a price. This one is called Yesterday's Man. Jack Valente lived in a house of ghosts, and the most persistent one was his own. In the year 2025, he was a relic, a man whose face was a roadmap of past glories and present disappointments. The walls of his Beverly Hills mansion were a shrine to the man he used to be. Posters for his 70s blockbusters like Sunset Striker and Disco Inferno featured a young man with feathered hair, a chest unbuttoned to the navel, and a smile that promised cheap thrills. Jack would stare at the posters, a glass of scotch in hand, and see a stranger. His career was as faded as the posters. He was now offering roles such as cranky grandpa or confused senator. His vanity, the engine that had powered his entire life, was running on fumes. One rainy Friday, a call from a seedy memorabilia dealer sent him scurrying to a dusty corner of Burbank. The dealer had acquired an item from the set of Disco Inferno, a portrait of Jack painted during production by a strange European artist who claimed to be a spiritualist. The shop was a crypt of Hollywood's forgotten magic, filled with cursed props and haunted headshots. And there, leaning against a stack of film canisters, was the painting. Jack's breath caught. It was him at 28, at the absolute apex of his beauty and fame. The artist had captured more than likeness. He'd captured the arrogant, predatory confidence of a young god who knew the world was his. The artist, a man named Sidorov, believed the portrait could be more than a canvas, the dealer rasped, polishing a tarnished Oscar. He said it could be a vessel, that it could hold on to things for the subject. Burdens, like the years. Jack barely heard him. He was transfixed. He wanted that man on the canvas to be him again, not the tired old man reflected in the shop's dusty glass. He paid an exorbitant price, ignoring the dealer's parting whisper. "Just remember, Mr. Valente, every vessel must one day be emptied." He hung the portrait in his cavernous, dust-choked attic and locked the door. He tried to forget about it, but a week later, he couldn't deny the change. The deep-set lines around his eyes seemed softer. His energy was higher. Then his agent called with an offer. Not a bit part, but a major supporting role in a hot new action film. It was the beginning of his second act. Over the next few years, Jack Valente became a Hollywood miracle. The comeback was meteoric. He looked a vibrant 50, then a handsome, well-preserved 45. He won a Golden Globe. He dated a string of young starlets. The tabloids called him the man who stopped time. When asked his secret, he would laugh and credit clean living and good genetics, conveniently forgetting the dark, dusty secret locked away in his attic. He was yesterday's man, living a better version of today. Jack was now technically in his 80s, but he was still a leading man, looking no older than 50. He was on top of the world, his original fame completely eclipsed by his legendary comeback. One afternoon, feeling particularly pleased with himself after signing a multi-picture deal, a wave of hubris and nostalgia washed over him. He decided to visit his old friend in the attic. He unlocked the attic door, the air inside stale and dead. He located the portrait under a shroud of dusty canvas and pulled it away. And he screamed. The man, originally in the painting, was gone. In his place was a thing of pure nightmare. The canvas depicted a withered, ancient creature, barely human. The skin was like yellowed parchment stretched taut over a skull. The eyes were milky, roomy pits of despair. The famous feathered hair was gone, replaced by a few pathetic white wisps clinging to a liver-spotted scalp. The iconic 70s suit, with its ridiculously wide lapels, hung on a skeletal frame like a cheap costume on a scarecrow. It was a portrait of a man who had lived far beyond his years, a man who had suffered the decay of a century. It had aged for him. Jack stared, his heart hammering, a cold sweat breaking out on his miraculously smooth brow. This was the price. He felt a surge of horrified gratitude. Then the creature in the painting moved. It was the trick of the light. With a series of soft cracking sounds, like old wood splintering, the ancient head on the canvas turned. The milky eyes focused on him. A dry, lipless smile stretched across the withered face, revealing black, rotted gums. One gnarled skeletal hand slowly lifted from its lap, not in a threat, but in a gesture of weary acknowledgement. A voice, thin and dry as skittering leaves, rasped from the painting, filling the silent attic. "Thank you, Jack." Jack stumbled backward, his own handsome face a mask of terror. What are you?" "I am the man who lived your life," the creature whispered. "And it was spectacular. The awards, the accolades, the women. You would have wasted it all. I did not." The terrible, impossible truth crashed down upon Jack. It wasn't a magic spell. It was a substitution, a deal. The ancient, predatory entity from the canvas had slipped out all those years ago and lived his life for him, becoming the toast of Hollywood, while the painting housed its true, withering form. The portrait wasn't a sponge for his sins and years. It was a cage for the monster while its proxy walked in the sun. "The comeback was wonderful," the thing in the painting rasped, its smile widening. "But every performance must end. The lease is up. It's time to trade back." A searing, agonizing fire erupted in Jack's every cell. He felt his skin tighten and crack, his joints swell and lock. He looked down at his hands and watched in horror as the skin thinned to paper, the veins swelling into purple ropes, liver spots blooming like dark, fast-growing mold. He looked back at the painting. As he withered, the creature on the canvas was reviving. Its skin was plumping, the color returning. The eyes cleared again, regaining their famous blue sparkle. The confident, handsome face of a young Jack Valente was reemerging from beneath the decay, like a photograph developing in reverse. Jack collapsed to the dusty floorboards, his body contorting, aging a half-century and half a minute. His last breath was a ragged, feeble gasp. His last sight was of the portrait, now fully restored to its original, brilliant state. The handsome man in the 70s suit gave him a final, charming, predatory wink before the image froze, becoming once more a simple, silent thing of oil and canvas. The bargain was complete. Yesterday's man was finally and forever a thing of the past. So, the ultimate Hollywood comeback, with the ultimate contractual obligation. The actor thought he had a magic spell, but what he really had was a substitute, a spiritual understudy, if you will. And when the performance was over, it was time to trade places. A final chilling lesson in being careful what you wish for in a town built on illusion, on display here in the Night Cafe. And so our tale has come to a close. The last cup's been poured, the machine has been silenced, and all that remain are the dregs at the bottom of the cup. We've offered you a few of our house blends tonight, a taste of ambition's bitter grounds, a sip of grief's chilling brew, and perhaps a shot of technological terror for the road. The purpose of a cafe, I suppose, is to offer a moment of reflection, and if you look deeply enough into a cup of black coffee, you'll see a face staring back. Our little establishment hopes you've realized that the most unsettling flavor on the menu isn't brewed from some exotic cursed beans, but from the dark, disoriented flexion of yourself that you find swimming in the depths of your coffee cup. So, as you leave us and return to the well-lit streets, remember what you've seen here tonight. Remember that for every wish, there's a price. For every shortcut, a toll. And behind every comforting facade, something with sharp teeth may be waiting to smile back at you. Settle your tab, if you can, and try to have a pleasant evening. I'm Steve Stockton. Thanks for listening.